Evans was an American actress, singer, songwriter, and author. She reigned as Queen of the West alongside her King of the Cowboys husband, Roy Rogers, in films in the 1940s and early 50s, and on television in the 1950s.
They were hailed as the King of the Cowboys and the Queen of the West. For over half a century, Roy Rogers and Dale Evans rode across television screens on their famous horses, representing the flawless, wholesome ideal of the American frontier. Audiences saw an unbreakable fairy tale wrapped in a white Stetson. But just before she passed away in February 2001, Dale Evans broke her silence. She looked back at the decades spent under the blazing Hollywood spotlight and decided to reveal the raw, unvarnished truth about the man the world thought they knew. It wasn't a story of plastic perfection, but a gritty account of control, grief, and survival. The Shadow of the Golden West. A blast of cold wind whipped across the set of the film The Cowboy and the Senorita in January 1944. Dale Evans stood near a wooden hitching post on the Republic Pictures lot, adjusting her heavy wool vest. She was a 31-year-old single mother and jazz singer from Texas, who had spent years trying to secure a mainstream big band contract. Instead, the studio executives had forced her into a pair of fringe-lined leather boots. A moment later, a golden Palomino horse reared up on the dirt path. Roy Rogers sat in the saddle, flashing a perfectly calculated smile for the studio cameras. The director called for a brief technical pause. Roy dismounted his horse and walked over to Dale, offering her a lukewarm cup of coffee from a metal tin. On the theater screens, their initial interaction looked like a bright, seamless fairy tale, but the corporate executives behind the scenes were hiding a deep crisis. Republic Pictures was desperately using this new pairing to mask a massive tragedy that had completely paralyzed their top box office asset. What was the dark secret the studio was keeping out of the entertainment columns? The truth lay inside a small, quiet house in Encino, California. Just a few months before this camera started rolling, Roy's first wife, Arlene, had passed away suddenly from an unexpected blood clot just days after giving birth to their third child. Roy was left completely devastated. He was a single father of 3 infants, facing an aggressive studio contract that required him to film 6 Western features a year. He couldn't take a leave of absence to mourn. The corporate machine needed him back in the saddle immediately to keep the studio from bankruptcy. Republic Pictures head Herbert Yates saw Dale Evans as the perfect logistical solution to Roy's domestic nightmare. The executives didn't just want a talented co-star who could handle the musical numbers. They wanted a woman who could step right into a pre-packaged family dynamic without disrupting the commercial brand. They began engineering the production schedules to ensure Roy and Dale spent every waking hour together on the backlot. The pressure on Dale was immense from day one. She wasn't allowed to show any artistic independence during the filming. The musical director, a strict studio veteran named Cy Feuer, handed her a sheet of music for their first duet. Dale started singing the verses with her natural, sultry jazz syncopation. Feuer immediately slammed his hand down on the piano keys. He told her to strip every ounce of Texas blues out of her throat. He demanded that she sing with a flat, wholesome choral tone that wouldn't compete with Roy's country twang. Did Dale accept this artistic censorship quietly, or did she fight back? The early audio test tracks from the Republic archives revealed her answer. Dale didn't argue with the music director. Instead, she waited until the final recording microphones were fully live. When the band hit the chorus, she deliberately altered her vocal phrasing on the final note, sliding into a smooth, jazzy crescendo that forced the studio engineers to adjust their mixing dials. It was a subtle assertion of her identity, but it earned her a sharp warning from the front office the next morning. Roy watched this quiet defiance from across the recording booth. He didn't reprimand her. He started inviting her out to his Encino ranch between the grueling shooting schedules. Dale arrived at the property expecting to see the lavish, carefree lifestyle of a Hollywood star. Instead, she found a house filled with chaos. The kitchen counters were piled high with unwashed baby bottles. A hired nurse was struggling to manage 3 crying toddlers in the living room, while Roy sat at the dining table under a single light bulb, hand cleaning his leather saddles in the total silence. He looked up as Dale walked through the back door. He didn't offer her a cocktail or a tour of the grounds. He simply handed her a clean dish towel and pointed toward the sink. The Hollywood publicity machine was already spinning a grand narrative about a magical Western courtship. The columnists printed stories about Roy serenading Dale under the desert stars. In reality, their relationship was being forged over colicky babies and frantic lines of dialogue memorized in the front seat of a moving studio truck. Dale was rapidly realizing that marrying the king of the cowboys wouldn't mean entering a glamorous Hollywood romance. It would mean signing up for a life of intense labor and profound responsibility. The final week of production on the feature film wrapped on a freezing night in late November. The crew was packing up the heavy carbon arc lamps, their trucks kicking up thick clouds of dust on the soundstage floor. Roy walked over to Dale's dressing room door, carrying his trademark white Stetson hat in his hands. He didn't deliver a smooth, scripted proposal like the characters in the movies. He looked at her and asked if she was strong enough to handle a house full of broken pieces. Dale looked at the small makeup mirror on her table, then back at the tired cowboy standing in the doorway. She nodded her head once. The decision was made, and the wedding date was set for New Year's Eve. The public cheered when the news broke across the wire services, believing the fairy tale had finally come true. But as the new couple prepared to move their belongings onto a massive ranch in Ohio, Dale was about to discover that the corporate script was nothing compared to the rigid, uncompromising rules her new husband maintained when the cameras were fully turned off. The iron fist in the white glove. Roy Rogers stood at the kitchen counter of the Double R Bar Ranch in July 1948. He held a brass stopwatch in his left hand. With his right hand, he jotted down figures into a small leather ledger book. He was tracking the exact time it took for the ranch hands to load 24 crates of promotional comic books onto a flatbed truck. The temperature outside was climbing past 90 degrees, but Roy's button-down Western shirt was neatly tucked. His silver belt buckle gleamed under the fluorescent ceiling fixture. Dale Evans walked into the room, carrying a stack of unanswered fan mail. She dropped the papers onto the wooden table. The public loved the easygoing, guitar-strumming hero who resolved conflict with a friendly smile and a song. That image sold millions of lunchboxes. But the reality inside the ranch walls was entirely different. Behind closed doors, Roy managed his household and his multi-million-dollar business with the unyielding discipline of a military commander. Why did a simple singing cowboy feel the need to run his personal life like a strict corporate corporation? The financial audits from the late 1940s provided the clue. Roy wasn't just an actor, he was the head of an independent licensing empire that employed over 60 people. If his wholesome public image cracked even slightly, the entire financial structure would collapse. To protect the brand, Roy enforced a strict set of rules that every family member and employee had to follow without question. He instituted a mandatory morning roll call for his children and the ranch staff at exactly 6 o'clock. Everyone gathered by the main stables. Roy stood by the fence posts, inspecting their boots for dirt and their shirts for wrinkles. If one of the children missed the whistle, they lost their riding privileges for an entire week. He kept a giant chalkboard in the main barn, detailing the daily chores, timed down to the minute. Dale found herself constantly adjusting to this rigid environment. She was used to the fluid, unpredictable schedule of a professional musician. Now, she had to log her daily errands in Roy's master ledger book before she could look at a car key. The business friction reached a boiling point during a production meeting for their upcoming radio show. The director wanted Dale to take a larger role in the weekly script introductions. He suggested she open the broadcast with a solo, comedic monologue to show off her personality. Roy immediately vetoed the idea. He tapped his pen against the desk and stated that the show needed to maintain a traditional, male-led structure. He wanted Dale to stick strictly to the scripted musical breaks and the closing goodbyes. Did Dale accept this domestic restriction without a fight? The master tape recordings from the NBC radio archives captured her response. During the live October broadcast, Dale didn't alter the script words. Instead, she completely changed her delivery style. She used a sharp, dryly sarcastic tone that made the studio audience laugh at Roy's expense during the introductory banter. Roy's face flushed red beneath his stage makeup, but he couldn't stop the live feed. It was a clear sign that his wife wasn't a passive corporate asset. The argument continued in the limousine on the drive back to the ranch. Roy demanded total compliance with the corporate hierarchy. He explained that any sign of division on the airwaves would damage their standing with the corporate sponsors. Dale looked out the window at the passing lemon groves. She realized that Roy's obsession with control wasn't driven by malice. It was driven by a deep, constant anxiety about failure. He had grown up in absolute poverty in a houseboat in Ohio. He had spent his early 20s picking fruit for pennies. He viewed his Hollywood success as a fragile miracle that could disappear overnight if he loosened his grip on the reins. The domestic rules grew even tighter as they entered the 1950s. Roy began auditing the household food expenses down to the penny. He banned the use of commercial cleaning products, forcing the staff to use basic vinegar and water to save on the ranch budget. He even monitored the family's telephone logs, checking the duration of Dale's long-distance calls to her relatives in Texas. One afternoon, Dale purchased a set of modern, colorful curtains for the main living room windows to replace the heavy, dark Western drapes. When Roy returned from the studio and saw the new fabrics, he didn't say a word. He walked to the tool shed, grabbed a pair of industrial shears, and neatly cut the new curtains into small rags right in front of the interior decorator. He told Dale that the house had to look like a traditional Western homestead at all times, in case a magazine photographer arrived without notice. The public never saw a single glimpse of this intense domestic strain. The fan magazines continued to publish glowing profiles of the harmonious Rogers household. Dale wore her white Stetson gloves and smiled for the cameras, playing the role of the supportive queen to perfection. But the emotional cost of maintaining that plastic perfection was growing heavier by the day. The iron fist inside the white glove was keeping the empire secure, but a series of devastating personal storms was about to hit the Double R Bar Ranch, testing Roy's rigid control in ways that a corporate ledger could never calculate. The unseen tragedies of the ranch. A small white wooden crib sat near the window of the master bedroom on August 26, 1952. The desert sun baked the roof of the Apple Valley ranch house. Dale Evans stood by the mattress, folding a tiny flannel blanket. Her daughter, Robin Elizabeth, had been born 2 years earlier with Down syndrome and a severe heart defect. The studio doctors had urged the couple to place the child in an institution the moment she was born to protect their public image. Instead, Dale had brought her straight home to the ranch. The telephone on the hallway wall started ringing at exactly noon. Dale didn't answer it. She already knew what the hospital summary contained. Robin's heart had finally failed after a multi-week battle with mumps. The public knew Roy and Dale as the ultimate symbols of unshakable American joy. But behind the bright television screens, a dark, recurring cycle of personal loss was about to test their marriage to the absolute limit. How did Roy handle a devastating domestic loss when his corporate contract required him to present a smiling face to millions of children? The logistics of the 1952 television schedule revealed his strategy. Roy didn't request a single day of bereavement leave from the network executives. 2 days after Robin's small funeral service, he put on his embroidered Western shirt, buckled his silver holsters, and walked onto the set of The Roy Rogers Show. He spent 8 hours singing upbeat campfire songs to a group of visiting orphan children. He maintained his trademark easygoing grin whenever the recording tape was active. Dale watched this performance from the wings of the soundstage. She was horrified by his ability to compartmentalize his grief. She wanted to talk about their daughter. She wanted to weep openly in the living room. Roy refused to participate in the morning. When he returned to the ranch at night, he walked straight past Robin's empty bedroom. He locked himself in his private trophy room, spending hours cleaning his collection of vintage rifles until the metal barrels gleamed in the lamplight. The emotional distance between husband and wife grew wider as they tried to fill the silence in the house. They decided to adopt. Over the next 5 years, they brought 4 more children into the blended household, including a young girl named Debbie from an orphanage in Scotland and a boy named John from an abusive home in Kentucky. The ranch was filled with the sounds of running feet and bicycle bells once again. But the dark family pattern wasn't finished with the Rogers family. On August 17, 1964, a yellow school bus carrying a local church group swerved off a rain-slicked highway near Dallas, Texas. 12-year-old Debbie Rogers was sitting in the third row of seats. The vehicle collided with a concrete bridge pillar, killing 2 passengers instantly. A local sheriff delivered the telegram to the ranch house at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Roy was in the middle of a business meeting with a group of fast food franchise executives who wanted to buy the rights to his name. He read the text on the yellow paper once. He didn't drop his pen. He didn't excuse himself from the room. He simply slid the telegram under his leather desk pad and continued discussing the royalty percentages for another 40 minutes. What happened when Dale discovered that her husband had hidden the news of their daughter's death to finish a corporate deal? The confrontation happened in the main driveway of the ranch. Dale took her car keys and attempted to drive to the local airport alone. Roy ran out to the gravel path and grabbed the steering wheel through the open window. He told her that a public display of hysteria would draw the tabloid reporters to the property. He argued that they had an obligation to their living children and their employees to remain completely stoic in the face of disaster. Dale threw the keys onto the dashboard and walked away from him. She realized that his strict military discipline was no longer just a business tool. It was becoming an emotional prison that was suffocating the family. The final, crushing blow arrived just 1 year later, in 1965. Their adopted son, John, had enlisted in the United States Army to satisfy his father's demands for discipline. He was stationed at a military base in Germany. During a weekend leave, the 18-year-old soldier attended a company party and choked to death in his barracks after a night of heavy drinking. The official military courier arrived at the Apple Valley gates during a heavy rainstorm. This time, the corporate armor completely cracked. When Roy saw the olive drab uniform at his front door, he didn't grab his ledger book or check his stopwatch. He sank down onto the wooden porch steps, buried his face in his hands, and wept out loud for the first time in his adult life. The loss of 3 children in a single decade had shattered the stoic persona of the King of the Cowboys. Dale didn't use the moment to remind him of his past coldness. She walked out into the rain, sat down on the wet steps right next to him, and pulled his head onto her shoulder. The public never saw the depth of the scars left by these 3 empty bedrooms. The studio continued to release promotional photographs of the Happy Rogers clan riding their horses through the alfalfa fields. But the ranch was no longer a symbol of carefree Western adventure. It was a fortress built around a profound shared grief. Dale had managed to save her marriage by matching Roy's silence with her own quiet resilience. But the business of the empire was still rolling forward, and she was about to find out that protecting the legend required a completely different kind of sacrifice. The secret ledger of the empire. Dale Evans sat at a metal typewriter in the guest house office on a Tuesday morning in October 1951. She pulled a fresh sheet of yellow legal paper from a drawer. Her fingers hammered against the keys, spelling out the simple verses of a melody she had been humming all week. She wanted a simple, memorable tune to close out their new television broadcasts. By noon, she had finished the stanzas to a song called Happy Trails. She left the manuscript on the studio mixing board for Roy to review before his afternoon rehearsal. The television network executives assumed the song was a collaborative gift from Hollywood's favorite Western couple, but the legal registry files told a very different story. Dale wasn't just a supportive sidekick who rode a horse and smiled on cue. She was an independent creator who frequently had to fight her own husband's corporate legal team to protect her intellectual property. Why did a married couple with a flawless public partnership require separate legal representation to handle a simple theme song? The answer lay inside the corporate charter of Roy Rogers Enterprises. The company was structured to automatically absorb the rights to any material performed on the show. When Dale submitted the lyrics, the studio lawyers immediately drafted a contract that listed Roy as the primary co-writer. This designation would divert 50% of the royalty checks away from Dale's personal account and place them into the master corporate fund. Dale refused to sign the waiver. She walked straight into the legal department's office on Sunset Boulevard and demanded the original master sheet back. She hired her own entertainment attorney, a sharp contract specialist named Donald Clean. He filed an independent copyright registration with the Library of Congress under Dale's birth name, Francis Octavia Smith. It was a bold, aggressive maneuver that caught the studio executives completely off guard. Roy found himself stuck directly between his corporate board of directors and his wife. He called an emergency meeting at the ranch dining table later that evening. He laid out the financial projections, showing how separate music publishing rights would complicate their merchandising deals with the television sponsors. He asked her to drop the independent registration for the sake of the broader brand. Did Dale back down under pressure from the King of the Cowboys? The official copyright ledgers from 1952 provided the resolution. Dale didn't yield an inch. She looked Roy in the eye and told him that her creative work was the only part of her identity that Hollywood hadn't completely manufactured. She insisted on a strict corporate boundary. Ultimately, Roy backed down. He instructed his lawyers to sign a contract recognizing Dale as the sole author and owner of the song. The victory established a permanent, quiet truce between the two performers. From that day forward, they ran their careers under a dual accounting system. Every contract for a public appearance, radio play, or television special was split into two distinct financial agreements. Dale received her own checks, paid directly to her separate production company, Pioneer Theater Enterprises. She used her funds to establish an independent bank account that Roy could not access or audit. The arrangement changed the power dynamic on the set of The Roy Rogers Show. When the director attempted to cut Dale's dialogue during the 1954 season to save on production time, she didn't complain to the studio manager. She simply instructed her attorney to withhold the performance rights for Happy Trails for the upcoming episode. The production crew restored her lines to the script within 3 hours. The crew members on the backlot began to treat her with a new level of professional respect. They realized she wasn't a passive employee of the Roy Rogers brand. She was a full business partner who controlled the literal voice of the franchise. Roy accepted this independence because he respected strength. He recognized that Dale's financial sharpness was actually protecting the family from the predatory practices of the Hollywood studio system. One afternoon in 1958, a representative from a major toy manufacturer arrived at the ranch with a contract for a new line of plastic Western playsets. The document included a clause that would grant the manufacturer permanent rights to Dale's likeness without any additional royalty payments. Roy had already signed his section of the paperwork. Dale took a red ink pen from her desk. She drew a thick line through the entire unauthorized clause, tossed the papers back into the agent's briefcase, and told him to leave the property. Roy didn't get angry about the lost deal. He watched the agent drive away, then turned to Dale and laughed. He admitted that his own legal team was too soft to handle the corporate sharks in Los Angeles. The public never saw a single detail of these intense financial negotiations. The fans who sang along to Happy Trails every week thought they were listening to a simple expression of marital harmony. They had no idea the song was a monument to a woman's fierce independence. Dale had secured her place on the frontier by drawing a clear line in the dirt. But the years were catching up to the ranch, and she was about to face a final chapter where the corporate empire wouldn't matter at all. The final interview in the high desert. An old leather armchair sat by the wide bay window of the Apple Valley home in November 2000. The desert sun was dropping low behind the jagged peaks of the San Bernardino Mountains, painting the sky a deep, bruised purple. Dale Evans sat in the chair, a thick wool shawl wrapped around her frail shoulders. She was 88 years old. Her hands, once capable of wrangling horses on live television, shook slightly as she adjusted a cassette recorder on the small side table. A biographer named Raymond Strait sat across from her, adjusting his notepad. He had come to ask about the golden days of the Hollywood Western. The public still expected Dale to talk about the sparkling white Stetsons, the heroic music, and the beautiful desert trails. They wanted the spotless fairy tale maintained. But Dale had reached a point where the Hollywood facade no longer mattered to her. She looked at the spinning plastic reels of the tape recorder and decided to pull down the final curtain on the myth. What was the deepest vulnerability she chose to reveal about the King of the Cowboys during these quiet hours? The revelation started with a story about Roy's final months alive in 1998. Dale pointed toward a dusty wooden gun rack mounted on the living room wall. She revealed that the fearless, unbeatable hero of the screen spent his final years gripped by an intense, overwhelming anxiety. The man who had faced down fictional outlaws every week was utterly terrified of the modern world. He refused to look at the evening news broadcasts because the violence and changing social values made him physically ill. He felt like an obsolete artifact from a forgotten era. Dale explained that Roy's rigid military control over the ranch and the children had never been born out of malice or arrogance. It was a desperate psychological shield against a world he couldn't predict or understand. The poverty of his childhood had left a permanent scar on his mind. Even when his bank accounts held millions of dollars, Roy would stay up until 3 o'clock in the morning, checking the locks on the doors and counting the canned goods in the pantry. The biographer stopped writing and looked up. He asked if Roy had ever expressed any regret about the corporate rules that had governed their family life. Dale nodded her head slowly. She recounted their very last conversation inside a hospital room in Victorville. Roy lay in the bed, his heart failing rapidly. He looked out the window at the high desert sand. He took Dale by the hand and told her that he had spent too many years protecting a plastic trademark. He admitted that his obsession with keeping their public image flawless had forced him to be cold during their deepest family tragedies. He regretted not letting himself cry with her when their children passed away. He had traded his real human emotions for a spotless commercial legacy. Did this realization cause a bitter rift between them at the end, or did it bring them closer? The audio recordings from that final interview sessions provided the definitive answer. Dale's voice remained completely steady as she described the final embrace they shared before his eyes closed for the last time. She didn't harbor any resentment toward him. She realized that the king of the cowboys was just a fragile human being who had been trapped inside a massive corporate machine. He had done the best he could with the heavy burden he carried. She told the biographer that she wanted the world to know the true story of the man behind the white hat. She wanted people to see the anxiety, the flaws, the arguments, and the financial battles. To her, the real-life cowboy who panicked over his bank statements and checked the door locks 5 times a night was infinitely more respectable than the plastic superhero invented by the Republic Pictures Board of Directors. The real man had survived real pain, and that was the story that deserved to endure. Raymond Straight closed his notepad as the cassette tape reached its end with a sharp, mechanical click. The room grew dark as the desert sun completely disappeared behind the mountain ridges. Dale sat quietly in the shadows, looking at an old black and white photograph of Roy sitting on Trigger, waving his hat to a crowd of cheering children in 1951. She knew her own time was running short. She had finally freed her husband from the plastic cage of Hollywood folklore, and she was ready to face the end of the trail on her own terms. The true legacy of the frontier. A pair of heavy iron keys jingled inside the coat pocket of an archival manager on an early morning in October 1999. He unlocked the front doors of the Roy Rogers and Dale Evans Museum in Victorville, California. The building was designed to look like a massive frontier fort. Inside, the exhibits were packed with over 50 years of accumulated Western history. Visitors routinely walked past the glass display cases containing old silver-trimmed saddles, autographed guitars, and vintage movie posters from the golden era of Republic Pictures. But one specific exhibit near the back wall always caused the crowds to stop and stare in total disbelief. Mounted inside a large, temperature-controlled glass chamber stood the preserved, taxidermied bodies of Trigger, Roy's golden Palomino horse, and Bullet, the family's registered German shepherd. The animals looked exactly as they had on the television screens in the 1950s. The public viewed this preservation as the ultimate monument to the Western legend. But Dale Evans looked at those stuffed animals and saw a much darker truth about the commercial empire they had built. Why did Roy Rogers decide to preserve his dead pets instead of giving them a traditional burial on the ranch? The answer lay inside a strict marketing memorandum from 1965. The corporate sponsors had explained that the animals weren't just personal pets. They were multi-million-dollar trademarks registered with the Federal Patent Office. The legal teams argued that burying Trigger would break the psychological illusion of immortality that the children associated with the brand. By keeping the physical bodies intact, the company could continue to charge licensing fees for public appearances and commercial photographs long after the animals' hearts had stopped beating. Roy had complied with the legal team's request without consulting Dale. He viewed the preservation as a practical business necessity to protect the family's residual income streams. Dale fought bitterly against the installation of the animal exhibit for years. She refused to look toward that section of the museum floor whenever she visited the building. To her, the glass chamber didn't represent the beauty of the Old West. It represented the suffocating, unyielding nature of the Hollywood machine that had transformed their real, flesh-and-blood lives into a permanent plastic museum display. The battle over the artifacts reflected a deeper, systemic division within their 50-year alliance. Roy spent his final years focusing on the material survival of his legacy. He spent his mornings auditing the museum ticket receipts and checking the inventory numbers on the souvenir coffee mugs. Dale focused entirely on her writing. She locked herself in her study, using her yellow legal pads to compose books about the family's personal tragedies and her spiritual journey. She used her prose to actively dismantle the flawless frontier myth that Roy was trying so desperately to preserve. The public response to her books caught the Hollywood establishment completely by surprise. The studio executives had warned her that writing about Down syndrome, alcoholism, and marital friction would alienate the traditional Western fan base. They predicted that the book sales would plummet within a month. Did the fans abandon the Queen of the West when she admitted the imperfections of the ranch? The national bestseller lists from 1973 provided the answer. Dale's biographical books sold over 1 million copies in their first year of publication. The letters that flooded the ranch mailbox didn't contain angry complaints from disappointed viewers. Instead, thousands of mothers and grieving parents wrote to thank Dale for her raw, unvarnished honesty. The fans didn't want a flawless plastic fairy tale anymore. They wanted a real human anchor who could help them navigate their own personal storms. Dale had successfully transformed their manufactured Hollywood product into an enduring document of human survival. On a clear afternoon in January 2001, Dale requested that her driver take her to the museum grounds one last time. The building was empty of tourists for the winter holiday break. She walked through the grand exhibition hall without her trademark white cowboy hat or leather boots. She stopped in front of the display case containing her original typewriter and the handwritten lyrics to Happy Trails. She reached into her purse, pulled out a small brass polishing cloth, and spent 10 minutes wiping the dust off the glass surface herself. She looked across the room at the massive oil painting of Roy smiling in his silver-trimmed saddle. She realized that the true legacy of their frontier journey didn't live inside the stuffed animals or the commercial ledgers. The legacy lived in the fact that they had survived the relentless pressure of the spotlight without losing their core identities. They had fought their corporate battles, endured their private heartbreaks, and managed to maintain their respect for each other until the final curtain came down. She turned away from the glass cases and walked out the front doors into the crisp desert air. She had spent a lifetime playing the role of the queen, but she was leaving the world with her own independent voice fully intact. The trail had finally cleared, and she was ready to join her cowboy on the other side of the ridge. The director yelled, "Cut," but the true frontier story